This is Grape Video 31, Pruning Grapevines that have been winter injured. Well, pruning winter injured grapevines can be very challenging. First, Mother Nature has already pruned the vine to some extent, and we're not always sure just to what extent, whether there's 10% injury or 100% injury and so on. So this is a topic that we're going to take some time to develop because there definitely are good and not so good ways to prune a winter injured grapevine. So let's see how we can approach this and provide some useful information. Well, even before we get started, we have to admit that this is going to be a lengthy presentation, and we apologize in advance for that. You can pause this and come back to it later, or you can come back to it later and fast forward the time frame and watch it in segments. But there's just too much to present on this topic to do it in a short time period. We hope it is worth your time to watch this for the health of your vineyard. I'm starting with this picture taken just last June in a vineyard in southern Michigan after we had perhaps the worst winter in terms of low temperatures in over 40 years. And this is a wine grape vineyard that should look beautiful at this time of year in mid-June, and you can see that there are many vines that are totally dead and a lot of vines that have very modest amounts of growth. So this is how bad it can get. It can get really severe as it did this past year. And this is a Niagara vineyard, or what we would often call a juice grape vineyard of white grapes, the Niagara variety. I put this picture in here to say that injury is not just a matter of injury to wine grape varieties, but to our juice grape varieties and our native varieties too at times. And this swale collected the cold in the winter and caused very severe damage to these Niagara grapevines. So we're going to proceed to look at a systematic way of assessing and then pruning vines like these that have been quite injured by Mother Nature by low temperatures through the winter. Okay, let's see how this works. How do we get injury? First of all, the red line is the temperature at which, and in an average condition, we can expect to get 50% of the buds on a grapevine killed. That's what it says on the left-hand side, LT50, the lethal temperature 50 in degrees Fahrenheit that is likely to kill 50% of the fruiting buds on a vine. The red arrow now points to September, and were we to have temperatures as low as 15 degrees in September, we could expect on average to have half of the buds by this graph killed on our vines. Well, we just don't have 15 degrees occurring in September, thankfully. If we move on into November, the arrow now points to about -5 degrees would cause about a 50% mortality. And there too, it would be highly unusual. I've never known it to happen that we would have a temperature as low as -5 in November. But as the big solid red line indicates, at -10, that's when we start to get temperatures that worry us about mortality. So here we are in January, And this graph says that somewhere between -10 and -15, we've dipped below that -10 line, and we are likely to get severe injury to the grape buds on our vines. Well, if you can see then, as we go past February into March and April, the temperatures go up. So does the temperature that will kill many of our buds, but we just don't get those low temperatures as we get into March and April. So most all of the time, when the vine has its maximum hardiness, its maximum ability to withstand winter temperature, is also the time when we are most vulnerable to getting injury to the vine. Well, I've thrown this purple line in because there are some varieties that can withstand very low temperatures and not be injured. This is a hypothetical line, but there are some newer varieties that even in January and February can withstand -20, -30 until they get a partial kill of buds. These are what we've come to call super hardy varieties. But those aren't the ones that we grow in most places most often. But the shape of this graph, if you will, does change from variety to variety, and it does change over the type of winter we're having. It's not an exact relationship, but it shows in relative terms that the hardiness of grape buds changes through the course of the fall, winter, and spring. Moving on, we are going to talk about assessing winter injury to grapevines first. We can't do anything about it unless we know what the problem is, so we'll just review a little on how to determine the level of winter injury on grapevines. Most of the time, our first thoughts of winter injury is related to the fruit buds. Have they been killed? Will we have a crop next year or not? And this picture shows the nature of a typical grape bud, with P in the middle standing for primary bud, S for secondary bud, and T for tertiary bud. And the classic explanation is that 2/3 of the fruitfulness of this bud, compound bud if you will, comes from the primary, which by its dark color we can see is dead, whereas the secondary might provide 1/3 of the fruitfulness and the tertiary none whatsoever. So I have in recent years just simplified my assessment of winter injury by just looking at the primaries. If there are live secondaries, wonderful. We'll consider that a bonus. But if we look at winter injury of fruit buds, most of the time what really matters to us is that primary bud. And if it looks like this in cross section, we're in trouble. We've lost that bud. Let's move on. Here is a longus section of a grape bud, and those same letters point to primary, secondary, tertiary. We want to cut down through a grape bud to determine whether it's alive or dead. And I've put these lines, A, B, C, D, E, F, to show what depth you have to cut through that bud with a brand new sharp razor blade to determine if that primary is alive or not. We're going to show you those cuts where those lines are made. The ones that we're really interested in are C and D, midway down, the ones in red. And we're going to show you what that looks like as you cut down through. The top two, A and B, are too high. We're just going to look at bud scales. We're not going to actually be into the bud region. And those way at the bottom, E and F, are below where we're interested in looking at the primary bud. So let's take a look at those cross sections. So if you want to cut buds and determine your bud winter injury, this will be a guide for you. There's that first cut, too high. All we see is bud scales. Same thing with the second cut. Now, let's go a little deep. Well, here we are. Now we've cut deep enough to reveal the primary and see that it's healthy green, meaning it's alive and it can still produce fruit for us. So that's a good cut. That's a useful cut. That educates us on something we need to know for pruning the vine. If we cut just a little deeper, well, here's cut D, and that too tells us the primary is alive and we can prune accordingly. Now let's go just a bit deeper. Well, this is too deep. Even though the tissues are green, the primary could have been killed, and we wouldn't know it if we cut this deep. The green tissues underneath it could make us think, oh, we've got healthy buds to prune to, at least the primary, and no. Even though the secondary here and the tertiary are alive, as I said earlier, I'm really not so concerned about those. So this is an example of cutting too deep so that we can't really learn about the health of the primary bud. And this is ridiculously deep. We've cut off the whole bud and we're just looking at tissues that connect the bud to the cane, and there's absolutely nothing to be learned by doing this. We're also concerned about the injury that occurs on what we typically call the cambium layer, the layer on the outside of a cane or an arm or a trunk that gives rise to new cells to grow the vine. We never really see the cambium layer, even though I point to it here and say see, because it's really just microscopic one layer of cells. But on the outside is B, bark, and just under the bark is the phloem that conducts things down the vine from the leaves, say, to the roots and so on. And in the middle of the whole cane is the xylem, the X. So we'll just leave it like that. But what we're more interested in, not the anatomy of this cane, is the color of it. When we cut through and cut under the barks, if you will, is it a healthy green color like this? Or is it dark like this? This indicates there's been injury to those tissues right under the bark, and it may not survive to support the growth of buds. Sometimes you cut under the bark and it doesn't even look even remotely green. It looks totally brown, dark brown. And that is likely a total kill. But oddly enough, something that looks totally dead can have a few live cells and can, on occasion, reconnect those cells and grow those cells to rebuild those tissues and have it function. Not fully healthy, like as if no injury had happened. But what I'm trying to say is you can never really tell 100% that the injury under the bark, anywhere on the vine, cane, arm, trunk, is really complete, even though you see a fair amount of browning. You might want to assume that, but on occasion it might fool you, and there might be some survival there enough for cells to start to divide and repair. But we should assume in our pruning that when we see anything like this, we need to get rid of it. We'll talk more about that. Well, here's a cross-section of a young trunk or arm, perhaps 4 years old or so. And I put this in here to illustrate that on one side of this arm, if you will, it can be very dark under the bark like this, indicating that that is likely totally dead. And yet, on the other side, it can be fairly healthy. So we often think that the part of the trunk that is most vulnerable would be on the south-facing side, where the sun can heat it up and then cool it down very quickly. So when you're assessing damage like this, sometimes you got to be thinking, what side am I cutting on? And is the trunk or the arm totally dead all the way around or not? Here's some more pictures of cutting under the bark on young cordons, and this happened just this past year. We'll start with the Cabernet Franc, and where we have shown with the yellow oval, we cut under the bark, and there is no browning. There's a light mint green color underneath, and that indicates that everything is nice and healthy under the bark, and life is good. As we'll see with more pictures, this picture of Merlot is in the very next row of a vineyard, but we've changed to a variety that is much more cold tender, much less winter hardy than Cabernet Franc. And unfortunately, that dark brown area under the bark suggests very highly that this is dead, and will not bear any growth this year. And then, in the same Merlot vineyard, there's something that's a little more intermediate. Instead of shades of gray, we'll say shades of brown that look brown. It looks like this is highly winter injured, but we're not sure. I can tell you now, after the growing season, that yes, all the young cordons that look like this were indeed dead. So when we learn that, sometimes we have to say to ourselves, it doesn't matter what the bud counts are. It doesn't matter what the percentage of bud mortality is. When we start to see browning, extensive browning, under the bark, on trunks, on cordons, on canes, we have to assume the worst. We have to assume that none of that is going to perform for us the following growing season. So we're going to go on to talk now about pruning winter-injured grapevines, the topic of this video, but specifically before the start of the following growing season. That is, sometime between when the winter injury occurred in midwinter and before growth starts in that following spring. This is the time we're going to talk about right now and what kind of pruning might be done in that time period. So, factors that will guide vine management after a winter injury episode. There's two that I would mention. One is the more vigorously a shoot grows on a grapevine, the more prone the resulting cane will be to winter injury. We know that when a shoot grows, sometimes we call it a bull shoot that turns into a bull cane, but if a shoot grows very rapidly, very vigorously, becomes large in diameter, we know that the large cell structure of that resulting cane is going to be much more vulnerable to winter injury than a cane that developed on that same vine, the same variety, that has had a more moderate rate of growth. And the second item, the fewer the number of shoots growing on a full-size mature grapevine, the greater the average vigor of those shoots. And what does that mean? That means that if you incur winter injury on your grapevine, and Mother Nature has already pruned it back, so to speak, because of that killing of tissues, what we do to prune the vine after that could make the severity of pruning all the greater and could actually aggravate the development and promote the development of cold tender shoots and cold tender canes for the following winter that could be susceptible to a recurrence of winter injury, because we already have from the original winter injury an unbalanced vine that's already been severely pruned. So we have to be careful how we prune a grapevine after a winter injury episode. So, vine management in response to winter injury. Situation 1. Say you go through and you assess the bud mortality on your grapevines in this particular vineyard, and the bud mortality is 50% or less, and you don't see much apparent cambium injury on the canes, arms, and trunks. What do you do with that situation? I'm suggesting to you that the course of action is this. Do the math to increase the bud count on the vines and adjust shoot density as needed. And what do we mean by that? Doing the math means if you had 30% bud kill that you assessed with your razor blades and cutting across, well, the logical response is to add 30% more buds. If you had 40% bud kill, add 40% more, and so on. And you can do that up to about 50% bud mortality, because if you had 50% bud mortality, you double the number of buds that you would have put on the vine. And you start to grow that vine, and if there's too much on there during the growing season, then you come back and you can remove some shoots and get it back down to the proper shoot density, which is the topic of another video in the future on canopy management. But if you have light to moderate bud mortality in that 50% or less range, you can make up for it by your pruning severity. Let's take a look. Well, here is the Cabernet Franc vineyard we talked about earlier, and we had shown you that there was no damage to the cambium on these vines. However, there was about 40% mortality of the primary buds. So we went about to increase the bud count by roughly 40%. And how did we do that? We did it in a couple of ways. Instead of having 2-node spurs, we lengthened the spurs to 3 or 4 nodes. Here is a spur with 4 nodes on it, where normally we'd only leave a couple. And we also took canes and pruned them out long and wrapped them around the cordon for extra bud count. There's one there, and there's another one below it. So in that way, we increased the amount of buds we retained on the vine to compensate for that mortality, realizing that those would function if they survived, because we had really no injury to the cambium that supported these tissues. Okay, let's look at a second situation of how to manage vines after winter injury. And we'll define this type of situation as bud mortality is more than 50%, and there may or may not be cambium injury on canes, arms, and trunks. Well, consider when we have 60, 70, 80, 90% bud mortality, that it becomes unwieldy to just mathematically make a change in pruning severity. For example, what if we had 75% bud mortality? If you did the math, that would say leave 4 times the amount of buds on the vine that you normally would. And if you actually went about trying to prune out 4 times the amount of buds on a vine, you almost get to the point of not taking much off, or wondering where you're going to hang all those buds on spurs and long canes. So it becomes a questionable practice when we get into these high levels of bud mortality. And when we're into high levels of bud mortality, we're likely, not always, but we're likely to start to have more and more problems with cambium injury on canes, arms, and trunks. So what do? Well, we suggest that the course of action then is to do as little pruning on the dormant vines as your labor situation allows. Let's stop there and explain that. By that, we mean that if you can defer your pruning costs till a later time, it will be viticulturally more appropriate to not prune right after that level of injury and to do it at some later time, as we'll discuss. But I do realize that at times on large farms with large crews that the crews need to be kept busy at all times, and sometimes a grower will elect to do some pruning during early and mid-spring, even though the grower knows that he doesn't know exactly the response he's going to get because he's not sure exactly what kind of pruning he's doing because of the uncertainty of the level of winter injury. So if you can defer your cost till later without a complication in your labor supply, then do it. And I'd suggest if you have the capability, just side hedge the vines to remove canes sticking out on the row middles. And then, as things grow out, if you've got too much growth in places, yes, adjust the shoot density as needed. Let's look at this situation to try to illustrate that. This is back in 1994, in the third week of May, and we have vines that look like nothing's happening. They look like they're almost totally dormant. Oh my gosh. Wow, that was severe injury. On Chardonnay, I should have said. Well, what should vines normally look like at this time in this vineyard on May 20th? Turns out that I happen to have in my photographic archives a picture of the same vineyard 4 years later on the same date. Normally, when we don't have winter injury, we have growth looking like this. So that was quite a dramatic level of winter injury on those vines in that 94 episode. Had we looked closer on those vines, we'd have seen things like this. We'd have seen this small base bud add a pruning wound on an old piece of arm that's just starting to grow. By this time in the growing season, we would expect to have lots of growth, but not on this winter injured vine. Nope, it's just starting to grow. Here's another picture at the base of a cane on that same date. Things just starting to grow. And here's something special about Chardonnay. I find it amazing, but we can get 90 to 100% bud mortality on Chardonnay, and the cambium typically stays healthy green. And that doesn't happen to all varieties. In fact, I can't tell you what varieties do and don't behave that way, but I know Chardonnay has for many years behaved that way for me. You can have high levels of bud mortality and yet the cambium has survived. Well, if you let those base buds grow, all of a sudden they want to take off. And so here we are, about 13 days, 2 weeks later than the pictures I just showed you, and things are starting to really become apparent. Notice that those are base buds at the base of a cane. All the buds on the cane were pretty much killed. Here, on the 23rd of May, that same date, out of a pruning wound on a young trunk, has grown about a 3-inch shoot. And wait till you see what happens now. From May 20th, when we saw almost nothing, to a little over a month later, those base shoots from base buds change from this to this. Isn't that amazing? Yes, the season is progressing. We're now almost at the end of June, and the warm temperatures and the warm soils and the ability of those uninjured cambium tissues to support this growth has allowed this flush of growth to take place. And we want it to take place, and we want as many shoots to grow as possible. Why? Remember those statements that we said, if we have few shoots growing, the fewer the shoots, the faster they'll grow. The faster they grow, the more they'll be prone to winter injury the next winter. So by leaving the vine unpruned, seeing what will come of it, as long as we have some live cambium tissues, is actually a good way to manage vines. And if we had too much growth here, then we could adjust the shoots as needed. In this case, we didn't adjust them at all. We just let them grow. Well, here's another picture of that same Chardonnay vineyard, only this is 2014. This is, 20 years later than the stuff we showed you in 94. And we've got a relatively young cordon that is in the winter of 14. After the previous winter, we had severe winter injury, and we left it here to try to get some balanced growth so we wouldn't get too much vigor in all the shoots growing on the vine. Let me show you this. All these canes now, outlined in yellow, are from base shoots. That is, they're not from buds that were on the 2 and 3 node spurs. Only one of them was from a spur, and it's the one outlined in red. But all the rest of these grew out from base shoots along that cordon. If we take the lines away, now if we were forced to, we could come back and use this cordon, and we could use spurring of those base shoots that are now canes from base shoots. We'd prefer not to do that. As we'll proceed in the video, you'll see why. But if that were our only choice, we could utilize this in the coming winter. But we had stuff growing at the base of the vine that was actually better choice, but these were good shoots to grow here because they controlled the overall vigor of the shoots growing on the vine, so they'd be more hardy going into the winter of 2014, 2015. Okay, we're going to move on to a situation 3. What if bud mortality is essentially 100%, and there's extensive cambium injury on canes, arms, and trunks, so little or no green cambium can be found? Perhaps, though, you have some live cambium near the ground where the tissues were under a snow cover. But you cut buds, you find almost nothing alive. You cut cambium here and there, and everything looks brown. What would you do then? Well, our course of action suggests, how do you prune it? You prune away all the vine parts to just above where live tissues are found near the ground. Make no shoot density adjustment during the growing season at all, because we've already had extensive, severe pruning of the vine by winter injury. This is not exactly that case, but I only have so many pictures to illustrate this strategy. This is actually some Riesling vines, and I put this in here to show you that there was an incident of winter injury on these vines where there was a snow cover of about 16 inches, as I recall, covering the base of the vines. And we got almost nothing growing out of the vines portions above that 16 inches. And actually, it would have been easier pruning to prune out, with hindsight, all the stuff up on the trellis when we had the chance, because it gets to be more difficult when those old vine parts dry out if there's no value to them. So in this case, with hindsight, I'd have lopped it off about a foot above ground, or right at the snow line rather, and promoted those shoots that you can see growing at the base. Well, let's go back to the little vineyard that has Cabernet Franc on the left, has Merlot on the right. Merlot, being so much more cold tender, was severely injured, very dark cambium, total bud mortality, almost no buds to be found alive, whereas the Cabernet Franc, as we said, had about a 40% mortality. So here we are at the start of the growing season, and you can see the course of action we've already talked about on the Cab Franc. And the Merlot, wow, we have no clue what's going to grow from where. So let's take a look at the next picture. Yep, oh yes, that's a reminder of how the cambium was so brown on those Merlot and not on the Cab Franc. Well, I got a hedger this past year, and I wish I had done this 3 months earlier than the date suggests. I think the proper course of action would have been to, in mid-May, just side hedge like this. This is a homemade hedger that I thank Glenn Davis and Rick Brown for helping me build. But had I, and I only got it working in August of this past year, had I been able to run it in May, I'd have just side hedged to get the wood off that sticks out in the row, and then I'd have just left it alone. But as it is, I finally got around to doing that, and the shoots growing out in the row, as you can see here, on August 19th. And we left all the wood. With hindsight, I probably could have pruned this all out in the early spring, because really nothing grew up on the trellis at all. And all this growth that you're seeing, and you'll see pictures later on to show that, all came from relatively close to the ground. But if you have any doubts, you can let old wood hang on the trellis, and the new shoots will grow up through it. People say, if I don't take the old growth off, where will the new shoots grow? Well, it's the same with a big old tree. You don't prune the branches and limbs off of a tree, and each year the shoots that come out on the tree, there's plenty of space left for them to grow amidst the branches and the limbs on a tree. Same with the grapevine. The old wood here actually serves to help hold up the shoots as they're climbing up the trellis. And by the end of this past growing season, this Merlot vineyard with the side hedging looked pretty decent. Nice canopy, nice healthy leaf area to regrow the vines for next year. Here's another situation. Sometimes a young vine like this gets killed to the ground, and you really don't have any choice. What comes out like this near the ground is all there is and all you're going to get. And so when you get something like that, you don't adjust the shoots because it's already been pruned severely. You leave all of those grow. If you want to tie some up on the trellis, fine. Let the others grow along the ground to keep balance on the vine. I put this picture in here because these are some Cabernet Franc grapevines after an episode of severe winter injury. And the vines in the foreground, in the first row, are what I'm trying to illustrate, where we came in and we cut off the trunks about a foot or so above ground. Nothing else was performing at all. and we had this regrowth happen. And this would be an example of situation 3, where there was nothing worth keeping at all, and we came in and kept whatever live tissues we thought might exist below the snow line to renew these vines. And this is what they look like in early winter of 2014-15. A last example of situation 3, where in this commercial vineyard everything had been killed to the ground, 100% of the primary buds had been killed, the cambium tissues had pretty much been killed, and the grower left things alone, and most of the growth is coming up from the ground. And the proper course of action here is to let what will grow up, cling to the trellis and grow up. Those shoots that grow along the ground, fine, let them grow. Run over them with a tractor if you have to, but allow the maximum number of shoots to grow, to keep balance in the vine, to keep the overall vigor of shoots depressed so that you can have healthier, hardier wood for the next growing season. This is another severely winter-injured vineyard in southern Bering County in southwestern Michigan this past year. And before I go on to the next part of this video, I just want to say that the situations that we have just illustrated here, 3 different types of winter injury situations, really are a guide. There are no hard and fast rules how to handle the dastardly experience of winter injury to a vineyard. But I hope that you can see that there are methodical strategies that can be used to cope with this situation. And in the next part of this video, we're going to look at life after the growing season that follows winter injury. We begin the second portion of this video, pruning winter injured grapevines a year after the winter injury episode. So let's assume you've had winter injury on your vines. You gave your best attention to them after that episode. They grew through a growing season, and now it's time to look at what you've got to prune them back to a healthful vineyard. How do we go about that? Well, first of all, you're going to find some of this. If the injury is bad enough, you're going to find vines that didn't make it. This is a small vine that has lots of crown gall around the graft union, and it's dead. So, one of the things that you do through that growing season and into the fall is you take counts of vines that are dead or almost dead. This is a vine with a single trunk just riddled with crown gall once again, and you might just as well get rid of this vine and start a new one. So when you're dealing with winter injury, part of the pruning is to prune out old dead and almost dead vines. So I say, rejuvenating a winter injured vineyard. Number 1, replace dead and hopeless vines. You do that by ordering replacement vines from nurseries, or you do layers. And we've been over creating layers when you do that for own-rooted vines in a previous video. So that's number 1, because if you have too many blank spaces in your vineyard, you're really going to lose productivity, and you don't want that to happen. Well, the second thing we need to do when rejuvenating a winter-injured vineyard is to rebuild vines. And let me show you what I mean by that. Here is a Cabernet Franc vine in mid-August this past year. See that side? That's healthy there. And we scraped off some cambium there, and there it's healthy on that side. But we come around to this side, and oh my gosh, that is dead. We don't like that. And so is that part of the vine. See how that happened? So we have a vine that's alive on one side and dying and collapsing on the other side. Not good. And here's what that can look like. On August 21st of this past year, I had vines in my Cabernet Franc vineyard dying through the whole season. They could even produce grapes. The grapes could be ripening, and all of a sudden, portions of the vine are collapsing. Boy, that is discouraging to get a crop that far, and all of a sudden it starts caving in on you. That side of that trunk was the issue. And we can't trust any trunks that have been through severe winter injury. This is the early stage of crown gall, and if you don't look carefully, you might not see it. But it's there, and it's going to expand, and it's going to grow, and it's going to take over that young trunk portion. So don't trust any trunks that have been through severe winter injury episodes. Or you'll wind up with something like this, and then it's almost too late at times because you didn't take the initiative as soon as you could right after the winter injury episode. Remember this that I showed you quite a while ago in the video? Here's that dead portion of this young arm or trunk portion, dark brown to black under the bark, and here's the healthy part. The problem is we really have no way of knowing on any trunk or any arm how much of that part of the vine is healthy and how much is not. I've taken apart vines at times and found just about 10% of a big old trunk is functioning, and all the rest has been dead. And that really drags the productivity of that vine down. So, as soon as the episode is over and we can get the job done, we need to renovate, rejuvenate our vines. We need to create piles of trunks like this and get on with new healthy tissues. We're going to talk about some strategies to get that big job done. It's not an easy job at all, but it's one that is essential if we're going to get back to a healthy, productive vineyard. Well, the first thing that we're going to consider in pruning techniques when rebuilding these winter-injured vines is to manage trunk renewals. Oh, and we've been over trunk renewals in detail in Grape Video 21, so we won't go over that whole topic. But here's a beautiful example that is pretty straightforward. We've got two of the largest trunks that are so heavily crown galled, we know we're going to get rid of those. And we've got a small little trunk on the right that's all but dead. And then we've got 4 or 5 or 6 renewal canes coming up. And the only doubt in my mind is this young trunk right here. I don't see any injury on it, but I don't know its condition. And because the other trunks of a similar age are hurt, it makes me suspicious. So if I have enough new healthy canes to completely renew the vine with those canes, I might be tempted to get rid of that trunk marked in red too, just to get back to a totally healthy base on these vines. Well, then moving on with pruning techniques on these winter-injured vines, I advocate that you come up with a way to systematically prune out dead wood, because there's going to be a fair amount of it. Here is the Merlot vineyard that we showed previously, and there was a lot of dead wood, And we went in midwinter and pruned out nothing but dead wood. Everything on the ground is dead wood. And anything alive and seemingly healthy has been left up on the trellis. So that's one step you can take in a systematic way to get back to healthy vines from winter injured vines, is to first go through and prune out all the dead wood that you know has to come out regardless of anything else. Well, there are some techniques for that. We may have been over this on the tools part of a video, but we'll refresh your memory to say, if you've got a lot of cutting to do, especially big cuts, yes, using the chainsaw technique that we showed in the video on equipment is one way to do it. And yes, I'm still in love with the reciprocal saw with the special pruning blade. So here it goes. We do that, and we use techniques like this. Use large loppers, whatever seems appropriate for the particular vineyard, and get rid of that old dead wood. And then, when we come back, we want to use wood that is not too large in diameter because it could be prone to repeat winter injuries. So we say here, the pruning techniques involve minimize the use of large diameter canes. Let's look at that. Here is one of those Merlot vines after we took out all the dead wood. And there are 4 stubs of young trunks that were left. And on those stubs are a number of healthy canes. I'm guessing that the snow line might have been something like this in the previous winter when this injury occurred, and things below that snow line survived quite nicely. In the past growing season, buds along those winter injured areas died out above the snow line, and things below it survived and grew, and all those lines marked in mint green are all canes, and there's like 15 or 18 of them. And lots of options to renew the vine back to health. And we created this option by having many trunk renewals, by having multiple trunks before the injury occurred, by saving all of this last spring so that we could let as much shoot growth develop as possible on these vines, even when it didn't look so neat. But we wound up with a great supply of medium, some a little large sized canes, but we have lots of choices here. Not the same story on this vine. This is another Merlot vine in the same vineyard, handled in a somewhat different way. And we counted 4 canes that grew out of that vine in the whole summer. That's it, 4 total. Now the ones that I just marked in orange are lateral canes on some of the large diameter primary canes that were marked in green. So it might look like there's more canes, but in terms of primary canes, the primary shoots that first grew, just 4 of them. We're going to take a look down at the base of this vine where I just circled the area in yellow. Here we are. And the reason I wanted to take a closer look is because you see that great big cane? In fact, it's not the largest one in the vineyard, but it's pretty good size. It's about 3/4 of an inch in diameter. And I don't like that wood. I don't want to have that wood for my new vine if possible, because it's going to be much more susceptible to winter injury the next winter because the cells in this great big large diameter cane are large, and when they're large they are much more apt to incur winter injury. So I've marked this. We've got that great big cane, and then another primary cane coming up the middle in green, and then the two orange areas are actually lateral canes that developed off of that big large diameter primary cane. Those are the ones we want. We don't want to go out the large diameter cane if at all possible. So we take that medium diameter green primary cane straight up the middle as one possibility, and we'll take that lateral cane that was right at the very base of the big diameter cane, the orange lateral cane on the right marked with an arrow, as a couple of really good choices to use to renew the vine back to health. Going back to our basic pruning techniques that we talked about in video 21, and we talked about using laterals, and we showed these pictures back then. So if we have that lateral cane that's arched over the top, we'd rather use that to come back with renewing the vine than go right out the large diameter primary cane. And I just kind of blotted out that primary cane to say we would wind up pruning it to look something like that. When you're recovering from winter injury, you just may have lots of large diameter canes that you cannot avoid using. But whenever you can, and as soon as you can on that large diameter cane, head for the lateral cane that comes off of it as a better choice for hardiness, even fruitfulness, going out and coming back to renew your vine. Consider the choice of training system. When you're recovering from winter injury, a lot of the time you may be coming back, as they say, from the ground up. When you're in that state, you now have a moment of time to consider, was the training system I've been using in this vineyard appropriate? Is it a sustainable training system? Has it served me well for many years, and this just happened to be one episode over a long period of time and I recover and things are fine? Or is it time to reconsider a different training system? We're not going over all the training systems. We have many videos on that. For example, here's the Scott Henry training system that I like so much. Do you have large vines in general that are out of control and you're using something like Guillot training that can't handle large vines very well? Maybe you need to think about going to something that can have a divided canopy like this Scott Henry system. When you have a lot of winter injury, the basic training system of choice is the fan training system shown here. And if you want to review that, you can go back to the video that we have on fan training. That's Grape video 10, and learn about that. Reestablish healthy trunks and cordons. How do we do that? We already talked about pruning out the old dead wood. Now we come back as a second step, and we've got all these canes in this Cabernet Franc vineyard, and we're going to go through, as we showed in some techniques before, prune those out and come up right from the ground with all new healthy canes. In this case, I'm establishing the Scott Henry training system on 2 wires. I'm using one new trunk, that is one renewal cane for each of 4 trunks like this. But I did this in a systematic way. I first took out all the old wood, then I pruned back, and there you have it. There is the start of a new, healthy vine in what had been a severely winter-injured vineyard. Time of pruning. Just a few words on that. Here's some data that we took years and years ago, and I'm going to circle that on these Niagara grapevines, in many years when we did this time of pruning study from November through March, we found no differences at all. But every now and then we did find this phenomenon that for whatever the conditions were in that year, pruning early in the dormant period, in this case in November and December, resulted in significant reductions in yield. And so, because this is possible, we would urge that you do a couple of things. Prune from the most hardy to the least hardy varieties. That's a matter of common sense. I think most people would do that. Leave your most cold, tender vines to prune last, so you can always make an adjustment if you get winter injury through the dormant period. And then delay pruning in low areas that are notorious for winter injury and spring freeze. We've done a lot of work on delaying pruning till after growth starts. And when we come back and prune, then we do it mechanically because it's really hard to do that by hand. But it doesn't hurt the vine if we come back after we see that we have healthy tissues and more than we need to come back and prune off the vine early in its growth when you have a situation that you're dealing with that had lots of winter injury or is a situation where your vineyard site is very prone to spring freeze damage. So, there you have it. I'm going to mention a publication that we have through Michigan State University, and it's just back in print. It was out of print, but it's been reprinted, and there's 120 pages or so. It costs $15. We think it's a good investment. Discusses this and many other things that we haven't discussed here. And if you'd like to order it, you can go through this procedure through the website shop.msu.edu and follow those steps as written here, or just call the phone number at the bottom. We haven't discussed at all things that you do in the vineyard to avoid winter injury in the first place. And we're going to cover that in another video later. But right now we're just talking about pruning to recover from winter injury. And we hope the things that we've mentioned here will give you some insights and some ideas on how to do that if you should unfortunately incur winter damage in your vineyards. Well, that's it for now. As always, we thank you for your attention and we wish you happy grape growing.